Today's show is sponsored by Datadog, a scalable, full-stack monitoring platform. Datadog's synthetic API tests help you detect and debug user-facing issues in critical endpoints and applications. Build and deploy self-maintaining browser tests to simulate user journeys from global locations. If a test fails, get more context by inspecting a waterfall visualization or pivoting to related sources of data for troubleshooting. Plus, Datadog's AI-powered browser tests automatically update to reflect changes in your UI, so you can spend less time fixing tests and more time building features. Proactively monitor user experience today with a free 14-day trial of Datadog. Visit datadog.com/frontend-cloudcast. That's datadog.com/frontend-cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody's doing well. Another Sunday Perspective show, and today's show is going to be a little bit different. Usually Sunday Perspectives, we tend to dig into a topic. We look at a historical thing. We try and put things in a little bigger context, and we're going to do a little bit of that today, but today's going to be a little bit of an appreciation show, and it's appreciation for looking at a company. In this case, we're going to look at MongoDB, who has really gone through a transition that a number of companies in the tech industry, especially companies who've been around for a little while, are trying to accomplish, trying to emulate, and are looking at sort of as a North Star. And I say that in the context of, MongoDB, obviously, as an open source project, has been around for quite a while, 12 plus years or so now, I think. As a public company, they've been around for a number of years. We're going to kind of look at the history of MongoDB, the commercial company, but to look at how they transitioned from open source project to commercial company to their IPO to, most importantly, driving more than 50% of their business through the cloud, right? And how you go about doing that is a very tricky transition. It involves a lot of difficult conversations to probably have internally, but also, some interesting conversations to engage with the market. And so we're going to try and dive into that and kind of look at kind of what some of the trade-offs might have been, some of the ramifications, and some of the learning things that other software companies or companies that are coming into the market or companies that are evolving in the market might take from what's been going on with MongoDB right after the break. Today's show is brought to you by CBT Nuggets. You know how much we value ongoing education on the Cloudcast, and CBT Nuggets is exactly what Aaron and I wish we had when we were trying to get our certification early in our careers. CBT Nuggets is all about bringing a personalized touch to learning about cloud computing, virtualization, networking, DevOps, and much, much more. Whether it's their hands-on labs with personalized coaching or the online chat functions that come up with every instructor-led course, CBT Nuggets' team of experts is always there to help you get the most from your training and your path to certification. You can check it all out at cbtnuggets.com/cloudcast and sign up for a free trial. You get access to the full catalog of great training, including virtual labs, quizzes, and other premium features completely free for the first 7 days. That's cbtnuggets.com/cloudcast. Today's show is sponsored by Veeam. The forecast is showing clouds, so make sure you're prepared with simple, secure, and cost-effective cloud data protection from Veeam. Take advantage of this exclusive Veeam offer that includes unlimited AWS or Azure backup free for 30 days. That's free for 30 days. $250 in cloud credits and 25% off when you buy 12 months. Veeam has you covered. To check out this offer, visit vee.am, Veeam/free-azure-backup-credits. That's vee.am/free-azure-backup-credits. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to talk a little bit about looking at historically what's been going on with MongoDB, the project. We're also going to more importantly look at MongoDB, the commercial entity that oversees that project or is sort of the lead on that project. And we're going to look at it from the context of, a few months ago, it might have been, there was an article that came out from the folks at A16Z looking at cloud repatriation. And it got a lot of news and a lot of notice. And, the premise was a lot of companies, especially SaaS companies, start off in the public cloud. And at some point they grow to a steady state. Maybe they're not growing as much. and maybe cost-wise, they should look to repatriate those workloads back to some sort of colo or data center. Now, that's not going to be the focus of this show. The reason I bring that up was because the sort of North Star that gets pointed to in that article, and I'll put it in the show notes in case you haven't seen it or didn't listen to the show previously, was Dropbox as an example of a company who had gone through fantastic growth, unbelievable explosive growth. And I can't remember if it was pre-IPO or post-IPO. I think it was maybe pre-IPO. Decided that their cost structure was challenging, at least at the time, and they repatriated or built out their own data centers for to be able to bring those workloads back into something that they had more control over, as opposed to paying the public cloud. Now, the reason I bring this up as the starting point is one of the biggest transitions we're seeing happening in our market today across a lot of different areas is software companies who have established themselves, or actually I should say technology companies who have established themselves for a number of years, primarily as either software companies, hardware companies, some mix of the two, a lot of times on-premises companies, targeting enterprise types of workloads, enterprise types of customers, and those companies and those technology sets trying to figure out how do we now transition those into the public cloud. And some of those are trying to transition those as purely cloud services. They may run their own cloud. So an example of that might be Oracle. In other cases, they're trying to transition those technologies into cloud services. So we see VMware, Red Hat, Confluent, many others trying to do these types of things. In other cases, trying to figure out how do we transition in more of a hybrid model, meaning how do I create connectivity, consistency between an on-prem environment and a public cloud or multiple public cloud environments. Now, the reason I highlight all that is because one company is really kind of becoming the North Star for how to do that. And the question is, should we be admiring what MongoDB has been doing over the last number of years, or are they going to turn out to be sort of a unique use case similar to Dropbox in that it's sort of hard to find another great repatriation use case, i.e. Dropbox? Will we be able to find another company who can make the transition, make the change, or make the sort of bilateral way of running business the way that MongoDB has over the last number of years? So let's sort of look back a little bit historically at MongoDB. About 12 years ago. So what does that mean? 2009-ish, the MongoDB project launches. At the time, it's very much like a number of other popular open source projects. It's driven primarily by one company, right? We've seen this with Docker and Kafka with Confluent and plenty of others, Redis and others. So you have the MongoDB project, open source project, and you have the MongoDB Corporation, which is there to commercialize and monetize for companies who want to pay for support and other types of things. The project is very successful. It goes and targets a specific technical problem, which is customers who a SQL database isn't the right fit for maintaining documents and files. Right, so you have a unique problem that gets solved, which is great. Their approach to the market was very much value proposition around uniqueness of a new database type, but also simplicity. It was easy to get up and running. It was easy to get started with, and that was a lot of their appeal to early developers, early DBAs. Was a unique problem case with a simple way of solving it. Now, MongoDB, the project went through all sorts of ups and downs, lots of growth, some criticisms about, how well it stored data and did it lose data and all sorts of things like that. I'm not going to get into any of that into this show. That's sort of in the past, and it's for a whole different technical conversation we could have with the folks from MongoDB. Maybe we will at some point in time. But, they went off and they did the sort of typical open source originated project. And they did some things that are pretty typical, or we often see as things start to commercialize. So try to commercialize it, build support, documentation around it, but then also begin to build some open core types of things. So open core, for those of you not super familiar with it, basically means one company, in this case MongoDB, who's the leading builder of the project, decides to start building some features that they don't give back to the community. And those features become things that they try and monetize and are only available in the commercial product. So That approach is often called open core, where the core of the product is open source, or the core of the project is open source, but the product that gets sold, it's foundationally still built on that open source, but then there are additional non-free features that are built. And those are built for a couple of different reasons. In some cases, they're built to differentiate into the marketplace versus, say, other groups that may have taken that open source project and made it the foundation of their business. In many cases, when you are the most well-known in the community or the most knowledgeable about the project, you're the lead of the project oftentimes, you probably have the most direct relationship with customers. And in many cases, you are the place that many companies come to with their most difficult problems, right? They'll come back to you and they'll go, we started using this as the open source. We weren't able to do everything we wanted to do. Could you do this? And this is one of those situations in which, the lead, especially the commercial entity, looks at that and goes, do we try and solve this problem for the customer and then put it back into the open source community, in which case they have a relationship with the customer, but they probably aren't going to necessarily monetize it, especially if the customer says, hey, I started with the free open source version. Or, do we build these as open core and potentially begin to start charging the customer because they've obviously identified that problem space is something that, if it's solved, creates value for their business. Hence, there's a potential that they may want to or be willing to pay for those features, right, and support for those features on an ongoing basis. So that becomes sort of business challenge number one is, when do you start potentially considering doing something as open core? And every company or every project, actually I should say every company has to sort of go through that thought exercise, because the challenge is once you start creating open core, you start to drift further and further, in some cases away from your core open source project, right? You also have to maintain and support those for the long term. It's sort of this double-edged sword, right? Do I want to take on engineering costs? Do I want to drift away from my community? Does this run the risk that somebody else will step in and sort of take over the community, the lead for the community? So that becomes problem number one. And MongoDB seemed to have navigated that pretty well. They continued to grow the business. They continued to grow their number of customers. They had a number of customers, above $100,000 and more. There's a really good article I put in the show notes that kind of walks through the financial history of MongoDB. And then at some point, probably around 2014, 2015, I'm guessing, MongoDB was obviously seeing the rise of cloud computing. And, the nice thing about open source software, or any software typically, is you can run it anywhere you want to. So I'm sure they had customers who were running it in their own data centers, but also beginning to run it in the public cloud, right? We were seeing, as we've seen in many shows that we've covered here, go back historically, the public cloud was beginning to grow quite a bit since, by 2015, it was a multi-billion-dollar company, AWS and Azure and Google and so forth. And so companies were likely running it on top of the public cloud, and to a certain extent, probably struggling a little bit because to run things at large scale takes pretty sophisticated operational people. And so they probably kept coming back to Mongo and saying, hey, it'd be nice if you would build some other great features, or features that were AWS aware, Azure aware, and so on and so forth. And so at that point, Mongo probably had to go through some soul searching again, another sort of inflection point, and say, hey, how do we do this? Do we want to invest in, kind of building all these features about, cloud specific so that they run better in the cloud, but yet we're not necessarily bringing our expertise and understanding MongoDB to the table? Or, as we're seeing more and more people get familiar with the cloud, be comfortable with the cloud, they begin to start saying, I don't want to run that software. I'd like to consume that software. I'd like somebody else to run it for me, right? So you shift from sort of customer managed to cloud managed. And so in 2016, they launched the MongoDB Atlas database as a service, right? And that's a really big inflection point because a couple of things. Number one, from a sales and marketing perspective, you're no longer talking about all these features and customizations that customers can do and all the unique ways they can run it and running it on premises. And maybe they're disconnected from the internet in all sorts of ways. You're talking about consuming it as a service. And, MongoDB decides what features are turned on, what features they want to offer, what price points they want to offer. The second piece is it really changes your economic model as a software company. You go from, writing the software once, putting it out in some place where you can download the file. And at that point, you don't have to pay to operationalize it. You just paid for the engineering. Well, when you're running a cloud service, you not only have to pay for the engineering, but you also have to operationalize that. And you have to pay to run the service whether or not anybody comes to the service or not, right? So that changes your economic model, but it also aligns to where customers are going, right? And so you have to figure out, how do I change my investment? Where do we change our investment? How do we prioritize how we market things, right? Because how you market software that people consume and how you collect, information about how they're using it, telemetry or some other means, is very different from running a service where you really understand how people are using it. You can look at usage patterns. You can look at consumption patterns. You can start to make more informed decisions about your software. And so there were some big trade-offs that have to go on. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of companies, especially that have been software companies, who are trying to figure out how to do that. You have to build up operational expertise, right? People have to trust that you can run it better than they can. And you would assume that the people who are lead for some software know how to run it, but not necessarily, right? Like in many cases, they just have engineering expertise. They've built the software, but they haven't necessarily run the software. So you have to build up an SRE team, a DevOps team, operational expertise. You have to be able to certify that it meets all the criteria for regulatory types of things, NIST and HIPAA and all sorts of other regulations. So there's a lot that goes on with transitioning from having a software project to a cloud project. And so, that was I'm sure a very, very large transition to make. Now, what's interesting is this was all done pre-IPO. So, there's the other sort of thought process that goes on of, can you make big transitions before you're under the scrutiny of being a public company, but yet you're still under the scrutiny of being VC funded and VCs and your board kind of looking at you and your numbers, versus a company that tries to make a transition after an IPO. As I mentioned, I believe, if I remember right, Dropbox did their big transition pre-IPO. Mongo rolled out Atlas pre-IPO. And it's a difficult thing because you change your margin, you change your product structure, you change your go-to-market, you change a lot of things that, from a market perspective, the market now has some uncertainty about you. They don't know if this transition is going to work. They know how the previous thing worked, but they're not sure how this new transition is going to work. In the case of MongoDB, I'm sure they had to go to their investors, to the market, and say, hey, the market is moving towards using the cloud. We have to be part of that. And I'm sure to a certain extent, people were asking questions like, well, if you start putting this in the Amazon cloud or the Azure cloud or anywhere else, aren't they just going to build a service based on MongoDB and compete with you? Like, how is that going to work? Now, in the case of, MongoDB as a service, that did happen, right? So for example, even though Atlas was launched in 2016, it took AWS 3 years before they launched Amazon Document DB with MongoDB compatibility. So there is some advantage of being first mover, of knowing the product probably or the technology better than anybody else. But there is going to be a risk of, when you have an open source project as your core, of that becoming a cloud service. So again, that's another sort of transition point, inflection point, thought process that has to go into that decision. And we can have debates about whether it's worked out well or didn't work out well, or the licensing changes that Mongo tried to implement to protect themselves a little bit. That's for a whole different conversation. In fact, we've sort of had some of those conversations previously. I'll put those in the show notes. You can go back and listen to those shows. But what's been really interesting is one of the byproducts, you would have thought maybe what they were thinking was, when we launch Atlas, we're going to take Atlas, which is, again, MongoDB as a service, database as a service, and we're going to go off and go after enterprise customers, right? Just those same enterprise customers we used to sell software to, we're now going to try and sell the cloud service to. And the interesting byproduct of that is, I'm sure they have, to a certain extent, continued to sell to those customers. I'm sure there's been transitional types of things that have happened. But because they can offer it as a service, and because they can offer it at a small footprint, because again, when you don't have to have a large sales force, you can just offer it as an on-demand cloud service. You can also start to have different consumption models, right? And what Mongo has figured out is this allows them to go after smaller customers, smaller SMB customers, mid-sized customers, developers that just want to experiment with things. And so in fact, what it's done is it's taken them from a very enterprise-centric company to allowing them to now have a new go-to-market that allows them to, go after different size customers. They don't necessarily have to apply a huge sales force or certain kinds of direct marketing. They can do indirect types of things. They can let people do on-demand things, so they can run different programs. And that's kind of had to have been a very interesting transition, because even internally, your marketing organization, the way that you run your sales organization and all those sort of things are going to be organized one way to begin with. And to start having to say, hey, we have to build up some skill set. We have to build up some tools and internal tech stacks to be able to go after customers that we don't have face-to-face meetings with, that we don't always know what their profile looks like, that we don't know how long they're going to want to consume our technology. Those are all very different things, and things that have to be invested in, have to be taken care of. And it's interesting to note that it took 3 years for Mongo to get from MongoDB Atlas launching to their IPO. They IPO'd in 2019. I think around the time, if I remember right, their IPO price was around $32. So, okay, great. They IPO'd. They had at least convinced the market that they were a viable entity to go public. They had enough of a revenue stream that was interesting to the market that people wanted to invest in. And what's been really interesting is, their stock price is up around $500 now at this point. So what that makes them about a 15x, 17x, stock growth since 2019. And what's really interesting is, people have looked at, some of the things they've done around licensing and competition with AWS and other things, and they continue to grow. They continue to make their numbers. And again, I think a lot of that is an understanding of what's important to their customers, right? It allows them to not only continue to invest in the MongoDB project, make sure that compatibility is there, that that way of people wanting to try it out for free in software is available to them. And then they continue to invest in not only additional features that people would pay for on the software side, but also investing in those same features being available as a cloud service. And obviously, for some reason, that model has worked really well for Mongo, not only from a financial perspective, the market has rewarded them, but they continue to grow. And, even though, people can have different opinions about, some of the things they've tried to do on the open source licensing side, sort of server side licensing to prevent companies who run MongoDB that they have to provide more things back into open source. And again, I'll put some links into details around that. They continue to grow. And so, the point of the show is sort of to look at, number one, what are the transitions that those companies like a Mongo have to go through? Because again, there are lots of companies who are going through these transitions, especially, not only existing companies, but, companies who started as open source, right? You have to figure out, when does it make sense to begin to sort of build maybe away from your open source project, i.e. open core? Does that make sense to you? That's a decision point. The second thing is, when do you start offering things as a cloud service? The answer is probably, as soon as possible, if not yesterday, if not a year ago, right? If you're not already doing it. But there are a lot of investments that have to go on in order to become successful at that. You have to invest in how to operationalize your own software. Do you know how to do it? You have to be able to, change your marketing technology stack. You have to change the way that you do sales. You have to change the way that you engage with your customers. And to a certain extent, you have to change the way that, you're going to not only release your software, because as a cloud provider, you may be able to release a feature at any given time as opposed to a big release. And so there's all sorts of both technical and business decisions that have to go on, have to be navigated. Like I mentioned, Mongo has figured out, at least according to the market, I'm not making any technical judgments on their product or their technology. We can have that as a different conversation. We probably should at some point. But they've done it in a way that customers continue to trust them. The market continues to reward them. And it's been a really interesting, last couple of years. I guess we're in 2021 and, 2019 they launched, so at least the last couple of years, to watch the growth of MongoDB, to watch the growth of, in the face of people pushing back against some of their decisions about their open source licensing and how they, interact with their open source community, but also how they interact with the cloud providers and what that means from a co-opetition perspective has been really, really interesting to watch, some of the ramifications of their decisions, what the knee-jerk reactions were from the community, what the longer-term ramifications have sort of played out to be. It'll be really interesting to watch to see if they should become, a model of what other companies should try and do. or whether or not they become sort of a unique unicorn, a la like Dropbox. We mentioned at the beginning of the show in terms of, what they did, sounds really interesting on paper, and maybe it's just too difficult for other companies to accomplish. So it'll be interesting to watch those two things over the next few years. Do they become a benchmark, a best practice for how to do it? Do other companies emulate it? Or, did they just create the right situation at the right time, made a couple of smart decisions, and, what they've done is not able to be replicated. So, both are really interesting options, really interesting things to watch over the next few years. And I'm sure there'll be more and more stories written up about, how this company who, had a similar starting path to a lot of different companies has been able to, break out of the original mold, move into new places, and ultimately, at least, for the last few years, find a lot of success and continued success from where they were, way back in the earliest days, the growth they had purely as an open source project. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. It was an interesting, I always like sort of going back historically, looking at, how companies got where they were, looking at the context of and timing of why they made decisions and, the outputs of those decisions. And so hope you enjoyed this. As always, if you've got some topics you'd like us to talk about either on the Wednesday or Sunday show, we'd love to hear about them. show@thecloudcast.net. Thanks to everybody for everyone who listens to the show. Thanks to everybody who tells a friend about the show, helps us grow the community, gives us feedback. We'd love to get 5-star ratings wherever you listen to your podcast. That helps us continue to grow the show, brings awareness to the show to everybody. And with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Hope you have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.